Association. And this is our first webinar of the new term. I can see that we've been joined by a number of people, by a number of our participants. I guess some people are still not quite used to getting up early in the morning, but I'm no doubt more people will join us as we kick off. I'm joined today, or today's topic is construction technology and the importance of construction technology. I'm joined today by Robert Adjetey from Osborne Clarke, who has the unfortunate responsibility for construction engineering disputes, and Jamie Hillier, founding partner of Akerlof, an MMC consultancy. So I think it's a fascinating topic, construction technology and MMC in particular. Even though I've got some unfortunate acronyms, Contech and MMC don't spring off the tongue as easily as they might do. But it does seem to me that we've talked about prop tech for a long time, fintech has been around for a long time, but Contech, construction technology, has the opportunity to make a fundamental difference in the way that we approach the real estate industry, and particularly for those of us in the build-to-rent sector, where we're looking to create a new form of experience for our residents. The ability to use quality driven by construction technology and off-site techniques is huge there. However, enough of my views on the world and how things are. Really, Jamie and Robert are the experts, and we'll let them do it. Just remind everybody who's here that we'll be recording today's session. It'll be available on the UKAA website within about 24 hours. You will see on the bottom of your screens the Q&A function and the chat function. Please do send in any questions to us. We'll both, if they're particularly pertinent questions to a topic of the conversation we're currently undergoing, then we'll address them as they go. Otherwise, I'll pick up all the questions at the end. And do feel free to chat to us, chat to each other. It makes for a lively debate. So over to you, Robert, and good luck, and hopefully looking forward to a really fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much indeed, Dave. Hello everyone, my name is Robert Adjetey. I'm a senior associate at Osborne Clarke, as Dave said. And I was saying to Dave just before the call started that I do hope that my focus on disputes hasn't made me cynical about the industry or about how these technologies are going to be used. And in fact, I would say that I am cautiously optimistic about how these new technologies can bring about change in construction. So I'm going to do a kind of whistle-stop tour of a kind of high-level overview of construction technologies. So I'll start by talking about three particularly interesting construction technologies. I'll say why I think these technologies are important. And then, being a lawyer, I have to talk about the legal implications of these technologies, which again I think is particularly interesting. But first I wanted to show you this. This is the hype cycle. So this is a table put together by a company called Gartner, and they plot new technologies along this cycle. The reason I wanted to show you this is none of the technologies I'm going to talk to you about today are new. They've been in various stages of development and use over the years, but I think these technologies are coming into what's called the slope of enlightenment. Great name, the slope of enlightenment. And what that means is really the rate of improvement is picking up, and therefore the potential application of these technologies is also improving. So the first technology I wanted to talk to you about was 3D printing. So I'm going to play this video for you. Hopefully you'll be able to see it, but I'll keep talking over the top of this. So again, 3D printing been around in various forms for several years, but the rate of improvement is really increasing. And that means what the technology is capable of is much greater. So for example, we now have the world's first 3D printed community, that's the video you're seeing now. And that's a community in Mexico developed by a company which aims to end homelessness in areas of the world that would otherwise only have makeshift housing. So again, because of the rate of improvement, if and when the big players in construction take this technology up in earnest, this could, in my view, be really transformative. So It lends itself to large-scale projects that can be easily replicated in multiple locations. It has a potential to allow construction at a fraction of the time and cost, and construction can take place in smaller areas, so we can make better use of the space. Then modular and off-site construction. So the uptake on modular has been better than 3D printing, say, but there's still a lot of room for growth. So in some ways, the UK is really leading the way here. So on the left there, you can see George Street, which is in Croydon, and that's a build-to-rent apartment building. On the right, there's Apex House in Wembley, which is student accommodation. We've also got Victoria Hall in Wolverhampton, which is again student accommodation. And those three buildings are in the top 10 largest modular buildings in the world. So you can make a good argument to say that the UK is leading the way. You can contrast that with the sheer volume of buildings in China or Singapore and ask, quite rightly, are we doing enough? Reason I put joint ventures down there in the context of modular, obviously modular and offsite lends itself really well to joint ventures because it allows different parties to take on the various different elements of construction, then come together for assembly, especially when combined with BIM or other smart construction programs. And joint ventures means potentially more inward investment and more projects. Okay, and then lastly, a bit of a cheat here, a catch-all of just smart construction. So I'll just mention a few of the items on this. So biometrics, so for example, fingerprints. So it's tremendously important to have really good data during the course of a project. So knowing who's on site, for how long, doing what activities, ensuring adequate resource, even as simple as paying people the right amounts. It's essential to have that data, and biometrics allows you to have that. Also, from a disputes background, that data becomes invaluable when you're trying to do things such as demonstrate that you have been proceeding regularly and diligently, or again, showing that you have expended the resource that you're claiming for. Advanced materials, so things like smart concrete. So smart concrete has materials embedded within the concrete that can expand to fill cracks as they appear. Or kinetic paving, so that's paving that as you walk over it generates electricity for the building. And then smart design, so BIM and other data-driven processes. So whilst these are just aiding traditional design, as it gets more sophisticated, these processes are able to actually generate new things completely. So, for example, self-supporting structures. And so that should in principle lead to less carbon-intensive processes, fewer materials, fewer components. And when you think that just the production and the use of concrete is responsible for approximately 8% of carbon emissions in the UK each year, those have the potential to bring about real change in the industry. Okay, so why are these technologies important? So I put some of the more conservative reasons there. So you can broadly call those first three bullets as driving efficiency. So we still do have really tight margins and a lot of insolvency in the industry. So it's clearly important to drive efficiencies. But I do think these technologies also have the potential to create a real step change in the industry. So if you think about 3D printing and modular, especially, these have the potential to completely change the way buildings are made. Again, on a large scale at far reduced costs. After the initial investment, and clearly with that initial investment comes a lot of risk. So again, the first few companies, if they choose to adopt these technologies in earnest, they have the potential to take a huge share of the market if they get it right, which is clearly a big if. Okay, so the legal implications. So first, risk allocation. So one of the first considerations in any construction project is going to be risk allocation. And these new technologies create a completely different dynamic between the parties to construction contracts. So if you think traditionally would have, for example, developer pushing a lot of the risk down to contractor and subcontractors for, say, design defects or workmanship defects. When you bring in these new technologies, though, you're completely changing that dynamic. So if a developer, for example, buys a product, such as a 3D printer or a robot bricklayer, where does the liability start and end for that supplier of that technology? So, for example, is there a liability for defective construction, so defects in the works, as opposed to a defective product or machine or even software? And is there a distinction between those things? And there's also clearly a debate for whether the technology has been used correctly or not, and potentially a whole new stream of expert input into litigation on that front. And then machine learning. So if the machine or software is learning and making changes to the way it operates, again, who carries the liability for the changes that have been made in that? I think we quite rightly place a lot of emphasis and importance on the ability of machines to take processing power and improve on their own performance, but it does create a lot of potential for debate about where liability sits. So there's no easy solution for those problems. What you can say, though, is that existing contractual matrices, contractual structures may not be suitable, and they may need to be amended or supplemented. And at the very least, I think parties need to be going into those transactions, those projects, with their eyes open. So again, putting a lot more emphasis on the front end work, consulting with experts in the beginning, rather than waiting for it to go wrong and then trying to decide, well, where did the problem lie and where's the liability? Okay, I will explain why there's a picture of David Brent on the screen, I promise. But building regulations, NHBC standards, health and safety. So I think the point here is that are these regulations, rules, are they fit for purpose? So regulations will naturally lag behind the technology. The people developing these technologies don't have the existing regulations in mind, because that's how they innovate. But in the interim, while the regulations are catching up, there is essentially a liability gap. So, for example, a contractor may be able to argue, well, I've complied with all of the existing regulations, all of the standards, all of the health and safety procedures with this new technology, but nonetheless, it's led to errors, defects, etc. And so again, that needs consideration in the front end to consider, well, do we need to supplement those regulations with additional drafting and contracts, for example? And then David Brent there, has he passed his forklift driver's test? So there's huge regimes of testing to show that people have met the right standards. And it's not so much that people will be lying about whether they've passed tests, but more about whether the new qualifications and tests are suitable. So it's such a fast-moving area. All of these technologies are incredibly fast-moving. Is the testing suitable? And will you know if X person has met the required standards? Okay, and lastly, data ownership. So I'm going to talk about this case of Trant and Mott MacDonald as a good example of how data ownership can be really tremendously important to the project. So Trant was building a new £55 million power generation facility. Trant engaged Mott MacDonald to provide the design services, and Mott MacDonald intended to implement a data room called ProjectWise to enable the design team to manage, share, and distribute design data. Excuse me. So disputes arose as to whether a contract existed at all, because there was no signed contract, and also there were disputes as to payment, and in several instances there were no pay less notices served. So in the midst of these various disputes, Mott MacDonald revoked Trant's access to the design data. They disabled their passwords. And obviously that design data being tremendously important for the project, Trant eventually applied to the Technology and Construction Court for an injunction that would force Mott MacDonald to give access to the design data. Now the contract would have provided the relevant intellectual property rights for Trant to use the data, but as I said, there was a debate as to whether there was a contract at all. So the court was essentially looking at competing worst case scenarios. So the court had to ask, well, what's the consequence if we get this wrong, if the court gets the decision wrong? So if Trant was given access to the data and that decision turned out to be wrong, then there would have been an infringement of Mott MacDonald's intellectual property rights, and damages would have been payable. Whereas on the other hand, if Trant was denied access to the design data and that decision turned out to be wrong, well then that would have caused huge delays to the project, huge delays to other parties, huge additional costs. They would have had to redo a vast amount of design work. And in that scenario, if it was the court that had intervened to bring about that circumstance, there'd be a huge debate as to who would be responsible for all those additional costs. So on balance, the court decided it was better to grant the access to Trant, and the court taking the view that that was the least worst scenario. But the court also ordered Trant to pay into court £475,000. So as is very often the case with disputes, you've got neither party particularly happy. So Trant has had to pay almost £500,000 into court. Mott MacDonald hasn't been paid for its design work and Trant's able to use it. So neither party is happy. And so what do we learn from that? It's much more simple than the use of technology. It's actually getting the contract terms in place at the beginning, at the outset, and making sure that those reflect the situation that you want to bring about. It means deciding who should host the data, who has access, and in what circumstances it can be revoked. Okay, so with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll hand back briefly to Dave to see if there's any questions.
Well, I mean, I've got lots of questions, but this isn't really my show. So let's go to Jamie and let's talk about it. But I think, Robert, that was absolutely fascinating. I mean, and although legal cases often appear dry, it is the underlying principles that drive them. And as you say, common sense at the end of it says, get the contract right in the first place, work out what you're trying to do and work out what outcomes you want, and don't pretend it's about bits of paper and what's written down there. But Jamie, over to you to expound on MMC and all the good things that involves.
Oh, thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Dave says, my name's Jamie Hillier. I'm the director at Akerlof, and we are consultants that specialise in modern methods of construction. Hopefully, my screen is now sharing, and you can see our first slide. So we provide services that are pretty varied by all accounts. That extends from strategic advice to a much more sleeves rolled up approach around implementation, working for both public and private sector clients. And the images on the screen is some of the projects that we've been involved in that give you a flavour of the sort of scale and type of projects that we embed ourselves within. I guess for purposes of this morning as reassurance, that does include build to rent schemes. So for the next quarter of an hour at least, I'm going to be talking through a number of principles that link to what Robert has just presented around the adoption and barriers to new technology. And I'm particularly mindful that technological progress is very much a cornerstone of modern growth, but yet it's very difficult to explain and quantify. Principles of investment, perception, pipeline, all of those areas are to varying degrees aspects to consider in the mix. But for me, I think there's a much more prevalent barrier to adoption of technologies, and that is habit. And I think that Bob Dylan pretty much summed it about right. Now, this principle certainly isn't exclusive to the construction sector by any means. Innovation is a real source of prosperity, and yet when you go back through history, the history books show that it is quite often unpopular. There's an adage that people are very open-minded about new things as long as they're exactly like the old ones. And whilst we may all collectively celebrate and remember the technologies that we adopt, I think we'll probably struggle to recall, if pushed, those that have fallen by the wayside, let alone the social tensions that surrounded their demise, and concepts that now we use in our day-to-day lives and embrace, that with the benefit of hindsight appear obvious because of their inherent benefits, have often been greeted with fear or stuttered to realise traction, dependent upon what they're displacing. I guess the strength of pre-existing habits that are being asked to change, and equally the emotive perception of risk that Robert referenced. And you can see a couple of examples, one from the 1920s around perception of mobile telephones and what impact that would have on our lives, and similarly an extract from the 80s. And when the telephone was first invented, one particular commentator said that it would destroy private life if it wasn't restricted. Similarly, the story of the Luddites is based around opposition to mechanism of the textiles industry, which arose because people were afraid of losing jobs. There's plenty of other examples as well. The shipping container, which now is reflected as a huge impact on the global economy, took over 10 years to agree a standard size of the box. And even in the agricultural sector, in the last century, mechanisation was pretty slowly adopted. Many farms chose not to invest in tractors because they thought their horses were easier and cheaper to work and maintain. Now that all links into, I guess, the hype cycle that Robert identified. And I mention these examples to illustrate that innovation is certainly not a smooth or immediate transformation as we may remember or recall it. In fact, it's very gradual, it's intertwined particularly with context and technology, the economy, those social institutions. They're all integrated systems that co-evolve, and that principle really does apply to technology and construction, and specifically to MMC. And I say that recognising that the benefits of offsite adoption are pretty regularly cited and generally understood. In fact, when we've looked at it, there's been over 3,000 papers, academic papers, that have been produced in the last 10 years alone. And yet, whilst it is growing, the adoption of offsite solutions is pretty intermittent. But that point certainly isn't new. In fact, last year was the centenary anniversary of what was called the Standardisation and New Methods of Construction Committee. It was a government committee which, aside from its particularly snappy title, was put in place by the government of the time to implement the adoption of new technologies, offsite solutions, and consistent standards. And similar analysis of the literature shows that the term modern methods of construction, whilst it's become more popular and more prevalent in recent years, it's actually been written about for over a century, and therefore it probably isn't quite as modern as many may suggest, I guess. So having dived through those history books, we've also looked at the manufacturing industry. We've looked at subject matter of productivity, efficiencies, the principles of lean production. And one observation I have is that time and time again, people and habit resonate as consistent themes. So I think it's estimated that in our general day, probably 40% of the decisions that we make aren't actually decisions, they're born of habit. And so whilst many are reviewing the rational business case, the economic and technological drivers, as an organisation, when we're working with our clients to embed MMC, one of the areas that we are particularly focused on is the culture, the irrational aspects and the psychological. And we think that the biggest scope for progress is interlinking those technological aspects with an understanding of social and behavioural science. Now, ordinarily, I'd work you through this wheel and talk through a number of different aspects that we're applying with our clients. I guess for purposes of time today, I'm going to share three simple examples that we are applying as levers to instigate change with those that we're working with. And the first one, probably the cornerstone of it, is making our clients' lives easier. For us, convenience is king. If you want someone to do something, then make it as easy as possible, because as humans we are put off by small amounts of effort. And the particularly tenuous analogy that I'll use to illustrate this is the orange. Now, the orange is the fruit that has all the dietary attributes that you say that you should eat it. And if you're anything like me, having probably eaten everything else that is imaginable in your house during the months of lockdown, is probably the one item that consistently is left in your fruit bowl, purely because it's quite often too much hassle to peel and clear up the mess afterwards. And in many respects, off-site solutions are similar to that, insofar as, despite awareness of all the benefits in principle, making the optimal choice is quite often harder than it needs to be. Demonstrating the business case for moving towards off-site, changing the points of engagement, the procurement strategy, the processes, it's quite often harder than just sticking with the norm. Now, a key factor in the build to rent sector is obviously the rental benefit that time and MMC may afford. However, looking exclusively at this element alone probably doesn't reflect the true dynamics of many of the schemes that you are working or looking at. And so, to enable a personalised definition of value that can take all of that on board, we've tried to make our clients' lives easier by developing a tool. And that tool just so happens to be an MMC calculator that enables our customers to evaluate offsite solutions and options appraisal in a much easier to follow fashion. And I think more significantly than that, we've collaborated with an organisation called the Social Profit Calculator that extends that tool to provide feedback in a quantitative manner on the social impact of their supply chain, such that we can look at how we invest our money along the supply chain in areas of economic depravity and try and support the government's initiative around levelling up. Both aspects, those tools that may be technologically complex, have been designed to make it ultimately easier for our customers to evaluate the option of off-site relative to their appraisal, and in turn translate it to a solution that doesn't have to be harder than it otherwise often is. Now, at the start of this session, Dave mentioned language and acronyms. And whilst the quote on the screen might seem somewhat profound, I think it is fair to say that clarity is king. As an organisation, I'm mindful that UKAA have been particularly conscious to distinguish the difference between mature PRS and an emerging build-to-rent product. However, I'd say in the context of MMC, most working in the sector are rarely so precise with definition and terminology. And the Building Societies Association, for one, have picked up on this and identified a need to standardise terminology to make it easier for others, including lenders, to understand and underwrite solutions. Now, I'm sure as an educated audience, you probably think you have a good knowledge base around offsite, but just looking at this diagram, I'd invite you to reflect upon the range of acronyms, the descriptions, the different language that encourages, as a result, a variety of interpretations. And we all use variations on a theme. I would suspect I've probably done so just in the past 5 or 10 minutes. So at Akerlof, what we've started to try and do is consolidate and simplify language. On our website, we've got a glossary, but more importantly, we've tried to accord with the work of the MHCLG in applying the definition framework and using that more consistently, so that actually people can understand what we're talking about rather than hitting them with jargon. The final lever that I wanted to talk through was one of perception, and I think we shouldn't ignore the stigma that offsite is synonymous with architecturally constrained design in many regards. That I don't think is born of fact. Robert showed a couple of examples, George Street, and you've got architects such as HTA that designed that scheme, as well as Adjetey, Taylor, and plenty of others whose portfolios I think really challenge the perception. And I would similarly invite anyone at the end of this webinar to tell me which of the schemes on the screen were built traditionally versus offsite. But offsite is nonetheless attached to what's called an availability bias, which is a mental bias that is skewed by vivid events that we can recall more readily available. And if my tenuous analogy with the orange wasn't enough, I've got another one for you. And that is, the example I use is of sharks. So analysis of deaths in the ocean near San Diego show counterintuitively that the death of a swimmer killed by a shark saves the lives of 10 others. Every time a swimmer is killed by a shark, the number of deaths by drowning goes down for a few years before it then returns to the normal level. And the event or the effect occurs because those shark attacks are far more vivid than the report of drownings. And for me, the equivalent shark for the offsite sector is post-war housing, and it's sufficiently strong, I think, that the House of Lords a couple of years ago, when they're undertaking their inquiry around offsite, asked the question that could the benefits of offsite be realised without hampering architectural ambition? Now, of course, the answer is yes. And from our perspective, we've proved that. We mapped all of the projects shortlisted for the Sterling Prize over the past 8 years. We're going to do the same again when the shortlist is announced this month, to demonstrate the use of traditional techniques versus manufactured and component and other elements of MMC. But I think these are the areas that don't really get sufficient coverage to address that perception. And I'm mindful that you will understand that perception can create urban myths that link to social habits, in the same way that there is quite often a cliche around rental tenancy relative to home ownership. There's cliches and positions around MMC. And what has been particularly interesting for me over the past 6 months of the pandemic has been the circumstances of how COVID has in many respects turned those aspects on its head. So whilst changes in technology have typically driven complementary change in social, economic and environmental landscapes, the impact of COVID has completely reversed the rules. And at the start of lockdown, there was a gag around how the leading force in workplace digital transformation wasn't the CEO, it wasn't the chief technical officer, but it was the pandemic. And that gag had real validity, because there was a period where everyone was posting on social media. You've got the illustration on the screen from our Prime Minister, with absolute pride around how they were applying technology. But it wasn't new technology. It was, in many respects, the use of Skype and Zoom and other, but had been widely available for an absolute age. And I think we've observed similar principles around offsite solutions. Any gap that's previously existed between early adopters and the early majority has now begun to be bridged as a new context has been thrust upon us. And the business canvas that we've posted gives some examples of that, but we're seeing customers anticipate shift in demand, which is driving private sector clients to explore innovative opportunities as they reappraise their projects. And that increased focus in product quality and low carbon solutions is similarly stimulating a gravitation towards MMC. So business models across the value chain are moving, and within it, the actors are exploring how they innovate to expand not only what they deliver, but also how they do so. Now, I think one area that will start to get increased coverage is the principle of platform design. And whilst for you, the principles of focusing to develop high quality products that are mass customized is probably a principle that is more prevalent than it certainly is in the public sector. But that said, the government are now looking to understand what areas across their portfolio can be standardized and what is repeatable. And certainly more progressive departments are beginning to develop product libraries. They're codifying rule sets within their design to establish reference designs that can then be adapted and refined to suit the project specifics. And that's a piece of work that we're involved in. But I mention it because I think the more traction it receives in the public sector, the more experience, the knowledge, the lessons learned will become transferable into the private sector. Urban Splash earlier this year launched their product configurator for their housing design, and I think solutions and adoption of those sorts of technologies will certainly become more and more prevalent. And for me, design is a key area that I'm seeing innovation adoption. The example I'm showing at the moment is an illustration of generative design, where through adoption of rule-based parameters, high-level schemes, feasibility studies that would previously take weeks or days or weeks to produce can now be generated and quantified in a matter of minutes. And hopefully you can see on the screen some of the illustrations around there. Now, these tools have been lying beneath the surface, I think, for a while, but there is a growing volume of designers adopting these more visibly, and I think that will start to open up new solutions. And for the build to rent market, I think it definitely opens new opportunities, but as with all new technologies, as Robert referenced earlier, new challenges and no doubt new questions. So for me, I guess just to wrap up, someone had said to me that, or I'd heard the phrase that innovation is a delicate flower, but easily crushed underfoot, but quick to regrow if the conditions are right. I think on reflection, from my perspective, particularly as our industry is under the auspices of build, I think the conditions could well be right. So it'd be interesting to see what does happen in the next 6 months to a year. So thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Robert. I mean, I have to say, absolutely fascinating. I've learned a huge amount, or been challenged to learn a huge amount in over the last 40 minutes. Now is open for questions. Please do submit your questions using the Q&A function or the chat function. Otherwise, you'll end up with me asking lots of questions. But we do have a question in from Kim Vernau saying, Jamie, Robert, one of the key issues for MMC is the response of insurers to what they see as a riskier project, particularly in terms of systematic failures. How would you address that issue? Perhaps let's ask you, Jamie, first before we get the definitive legal answer from Robert.
Yeah, Kim has a very good habit of asking difficult questions.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think it is a real issue, and I think the principle of looking at systemic failure is a really important one, because I think you can certainly substitute in individual components, but actually what impact does that have as an overall system is a unclear question and needs to be reviewed in individual circumstances. And I think the reflection and lessons learned from Grenfell have very quickly brought that to the forefront, as it rightly should be. I think for me, as with all approaches, we need to they need to be reviewed at a system level, and that should be reviewed from a review of technology readiness levels and a risk approach, and that should be done in as close liaison with your insurers as possible. I equally would suggest that as we look forward to innovations, there is a principle that we need to recognise that the tried and tested methods, if bound in a different formation, are not without their own risk as well. So I think those principles are going through that due diligence applies in any circumstances, but definitely to review the principle of technology readiness levels and make sure that the understanding of what you are developing at a component, entity and system level is thoroughly reviewed is I think for our sector a key thing to be taken on board.
Does that imply that the insurers don't have the capacity or thought processes to treat that in a systematic fashion, whereas traditional building insurance, sorry, Kim, I'm probably talking nonsense here. So traditional building insurance is about the finished product and the quality of that finished product, whereas, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't go that far. I think with new technologies, there is a greater perception of risk and uncertainty, and therefore the question is easily raised and should be reviewed. I think going through that process to answer those questions needs to be done, and I think if there is uncertainty, then it should be considered. Equally, I do feel that pre-existing technologies, as Grenfell's illustrated, should equally have the same degree of robustness. So it's not. I think where we are developing new elements from an insurance perspective, yes, I wouldn't expect the insurers to necessarily have that technological awareness, and it is right that they put that challenge down, I guess. But
I was just going to say
across the board. So
I was just going to add, I agree with all of that, and I think that the problem that insurers will have with these new technologies is insurers clearly love data, they love having the experience, having all of the information of previous projects so they can factor that in. So it means that developer parties making these new projects have to distinguish between the failures of these new technologies when they're first introduced and say how they've improved, how they've made that better, which is a real uphill struggle when they don't have the data to back that up. So there's always an element of speculation. And as Jamie said, I think one part of that is these parties are going to have to change their own risk profiles and kind of accept greater risk themselves rather than looking to insurers in a lot of instances.
Okay, Kim, do feel free to come back to us with any more points on the insurance issue. I think it's an absolutely crucial one in enabling MMC to move forward. Perhaps I could just put in a couple of questions of my own. One thing that is often said to me is that the issue around adoption of MMC is both a question of capacity and commitment. That if you're going to build an off-site construction facility, you need commitment because it's a huge fixed cost. You need commitment for taking the output. But there is insufficient capacity at the minute for people to feel confident about committing to doing that. Is that true, Jamie? Is it true, Robert? Is it just a false urban myth?
Robert, do you want me to go first?
Yeah, you go first.
I don't think it's an urban myth. I think if you view off-site production and manufacture as a factory, then consistency of pipeline and throughput is key. What you'll observe if you looked at certain manufacturers' accounts over a number of years, you'd see that they have bumper years in certain respects financially, and then some really poor years, and that's quite often just reflective of the variety of demand. So consistency of demand is key. Equally, I think it's not an urban myth to suggest that there are limits to the capacity within the market, and people will only size their production facilities and factories to reflect the demand that they think is viable, which is an essential part of business modelling. I think what's interesting for me is how some organisations are collaborating to address that. So a number of local authorities, for example, grouping together to create that consistent demand that enables them to provide that consistent pipeline. So almost, I guess, uncommon allies aligning for a common purpose to collaborate to enable that consistency and then mitigate that risk. And that's where I think some of the dynamics of the market are shifting in quite interesting and unique ways.
Shifting in what way, Jamie? Sorry, Robert.
So I guess rather than working in singularity, and Robert referenced joint ventures, but actually customers that ordinarily might compete, actually aggregating demand to then work with the supply chain, not a consistent demand, recognising that will support their supply chain.
So, Robert, I interrupted you.
No, not at all. I was actually going to ask another question of Jamie, actually, because I think
you're not allowed to do that, are you?
It's all open for it. So, I was going to ask, with old methods of construction, the risk profile is much more certain, and even where, say, companies take these new risks, for example, going to a different geographical area, or I know going from build to rent into student accommodation, etc. The new technologies bring a new risk profile, and also, as you touched upon in your talk, the virus brings a new risk profile. I just wonder whether you've seen anyone who's kind of been able to put their head above the parapet and say, okay, well, this is a new opportunity, particularly with the virus, because I think, as you touched upon, the virus has the potential to accelerate the adoption of new technologies, or accelerate the, say, de-urbanization, where people are willing to move away from big cities, and whether you've seen any companies who have already started to say, right, well, we need to push into those areas as a result.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the example I referenced around the sort of collaboration, there's examples of building better alliance and procurement for housing, creating new procurement models to enable that. So there's organisations that those are reviewing those models. You've then got new entrants such as the likes of, probably not as new now, but the likes of Top Hat and Project Utopia that are looking at vertically integrated models. But equally, I don't think people necessarily have to vertically integrate to embrace MMC. Others are looking at the other extremity and just trying to manage their supply chain in a more collaborative environment. And certainly certain businesses are reevaluating their relationships with their suppliers, as well as their customer segments and their target markets, to try and adapt their business model. So I think probably a long-winded answer to your question, but yes, there are a number of organisations that are shifting their model to suit. And with all these things, for me, you've got I referenced the technological innovation and how that links to social context, but within a business model, you've got those revenue streams that are linked to your customer segments, that is linked to your value proposition, that is linked to your resources and your relationships, and therefore a number of organisations are tweaking different elements with a ripple effect across.
Thank you. We touched on a conversation just before that we launched the webinar on the organisational issues. Traditionally, construction methods have been seen as an issue of procurement, but that doesn't seem to be appropriate for MMC. How should organisations approach deciding whether to use traditional or modern methods of construction and organise themselves to do that most effectively?
For me, Dave, I stick by the principle of horses for courses, and whilst I work for a company that, in fact, I introduced myself as an MMC consultant. For me, you should only adopt MMC where it provides you value. So going back to the basics of your business model and determining what it is that you want to achieve, and then the question of which can best realise that, whether it be MMC or traditional, that's the approach to adopt. I think if you try and shoehorn in, whether it be MMC or any other form of technology, for the purposes of using it, then you've missed the point. For me, technology is the enabler, not the ends, and therefore your decision as to when, how, and when to adopt it should be based on those parameters. Because if you don't have that reason, for me, you've probably lost your way.
Thank you. I think it's very easy to get lost these days. And probably a final question, unless anyone in the audience wants to add something. We at the UKAA are very much in favour of saying that build to rent is about giving customers the best experience they can. It's about designing an experience, not designing a building. How can MMC, how can all the technology you've talked about, Contech, contribute to doing that? We've talked very much about the production process, but if I start from a customer, how can I say, actually, these things can help me create a different, a unique, a more satisfying customer experience?
Well, I think actually Jamie touched on this in his talk again, the perception that these new technologies will create kind of a cookie cutter construction, just banging out the same thing over and over again, not particularly aesthetically pleasing. But I do think that's an outdated perception. I think that is wrong. And actually, if you think about, let's talk about 3D printing or even the BIM and design data, different processes, those have the ability to create better use of existing spaces. And clearly in and around cities, we do have limited spaces that we need to reimagine, redesign, particularly with, again, mentioning the virus. People are going to be wanting to use those spaces in a completely different way. It's not just they sleep in one place and then they go out to do other things, work in the city or have their entertainment elsewhere. They do need to completely rediscover those spaces. I think the technology has the ability to show where the potential redevelopment can take place and develop it better in those existing spaces. And just briefly, because it's been raised by Ed Folks, Ed's mentioned AI more in the context of professional services, but certainly the AI has a role to play in that development of spaces, seeing where can be used in what ways. And just in relation to Ed's point about professional services, I completely agree with Ed that AI will have the ability to bring together the different professional consultants and also, dare I say, in some instances, replace professional services. So, and I include myself in that bracket, unfortunately. And we've seen things like the Neuralink, which is kind of interesting and terrifying in equal measure, but as those processes get more and more advanced, you can certainly envisage that professional services can be supplemented and possibly even replaced.
For our viewers, because Ed's question can really only be seen currently by myself and Jamie and Robert. This way, Ed asked the question: it appears that technological advancement in AI could be revolutionary to professional services, joining in a more seamless manner architecture, civil, M&E, etc., reducing development costs while improving advice and reducing risk. Where is the forefront of research in professional services AI, and how far away are we to producing a joined-up solution for all to tap into? Excellent question, which I think Robert's gone a pretty long way to answer. Jamie, is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
In response to Ed's question, I guess I'm always cautious about making predictions in the future. there is, as Ed references, there is definitely movements afoot, and we are seeing a number of different organisations, certainly the work that we're doing, that are investing in exploring those for exactly that reason of recognition as to what extent it will commoditise the services that they provide, and therefore trying to adapt to that potential as opposed to. So it'd be interesting as to what direction it takes.
Yeah, it's now 9:57, and I'm very conscious of trying to manage time effectively. So I think we probably need to draw to a close at this point. Kim has just very kindly reminded us of the benefits of BOPAS, and there's a very interesting comment from Julian Blahut there, which I think everybody can see, so I won't read it out. But anyway, what I'd like to do is thank Jamie and Robert for, genuinely, I think, a fascinating conversation, a great topic, and some great insights into it, and actually some different insights, I think, in many ways. I think, Jamie, particularly your focus on the psychological, and Robert pointing out the issues around contracts are things that are often not mentioned in this context. So thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. I'd remind you that this is recorded and will be available on our website shortly. For those of you who are keen to attend more of our events, we've got another 4 or 5 webinars over the next few weeks. Next Tuesday, we're back on the theme of technology with robotic process automation for build to rent by Redirect Consulting. Our friends at Clevio, who do auto-managed access, have got safe ways to manage access that emerging from COVID-19. And then a slightly different topic, on the 1st of October, we have Lifting BTR in the Halls of Power. How can the sector elevate itself with policymakers, which are presented by Arcadis, but with features Lord Gavin Barwell, I think, giving us his insights into how that might work. So those hopefully are interesting topics. I look forward to some of you joining us. Otherwise, we do also have a couple of the forums for those who are members. But thank you. And once again, been a really great session. Jamie, Robert, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you.